Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
India enjoys neither economic nor political hegemony in South Asia and must therefore assume a global role only in its alliance, possible or potential with the US. India is neutral on Ukraine but wavers on Israel because she can forsake neither the West nor the non-West. She makes common cause with the former not so much through democracy as in the past, the world's largest democracy, you will know that phrase, but rather through narratives around counterterrorism, or anti-Islamist or anti-Muslim feeling, while identifying with Israel as a strong state in a hostile neighborhood. Torn between her global and regional ambitions, India's ambiguous international status reveals a great deal about the position of all the West's alleged rivals. Even when she had sought a leadership role in an Asian or Afro-Asian political project dating from colonial times, India had also wanted to be included within a Western geopolitical order. Well, you may recall that even at the height of the non-aligned movement, Nehru would frequently sacrifice going to non-aligned meetings and go to the Commonwealth conferences instead. He saw that as being more important.
This episode is an extract from an in-person session that took place in December 2023 at the BIC premises as part of Alliance University's public lecture series. Dr. Faisal Devji from the University of Oxford travels back to the contemporary context, exploring the dynamics of the fragmented international order following the impactful events in Ukraine and Gaza.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So we moved from a deep historical account of creolization in all its various meanings to, if you will, a commentary on current affairs. And this is a piece I've written which has not yet appeared in print, but it will in a week or so in the Boston Review. And it was written as part of my response, my effort to think through the two wars that face us. There are actually more than two. There's a very destructive one in the Sudan as well, which doesn't get written about. But the two which, of course, are of grave import and consequence and are attended to are the wars in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. And I wanted to put them together to see what they tell us about the nature of the global order such as it is and of its possible future. So it's a highly speculative paper, but I hope it will do something to open up the very real concerns that both these wars have provoked globally. So in his address to the nation on the 20th of October, President Biden brought together the wars in Ukraine and Gaza to illustrate America's indispensable role in protecting the international order from threats like Russia and Hamas. It was a strange pairing. Russia, after all, is a vast state with nuclear arms, while Hamas is a non-state movement operating in a small parcel of land whose borders and energy, food and water are controlled by Israel. Perhaps Biden was responding to critics who accused him of hypocrisy in condemning Russian attacks on civilians but not Israeli ones. Yet he was right in putting the two conflicts together because in both cases, the US and its allies have opted for war rather than the diplomacy, negotiations and ceasefires through which alone does peace become possible. These must apparently wait until the enemy has been sufficiently degraded to accept terms they prefer. But this strategy has failed in Ukraine and is unlikely to succeed for Israel. The similarity of the West's response to conflict in Eastern Europe and the Middle East suggests that it is not defined by the specificity of either case, but instead tells us something about the changing structure of American power more generally. Biden is correct in seeing both conflicts as challenges to America's hegemony and its global politics. Yet it is not the wars themselves that pose a threat to the unipolarity that has defined the international order since the end of the Cold War, but rather the unwillingness of many allied and even client states to go along with them. In Ukraine, the attempt on both sides of this conflict to define it by invoking the Second World War and Cold War failed to gain any traction in the world outside the West. You will recall that when the Ukraine war began, the talk was all about Cold War and Second World War precedents. These were indeed shared by the Russians and their opponents. They shared the same language. There, in the world outside the West, it was the failure of the war on terror in putting together a stable new international order that proved to be a more relevant and cautionary precedent, dissuading countries from choosing sides in the war. While Western historical narratives have been provincialized in this way, the rest of the world seemingly has no alternatives to offer. Yet those refusing to align with the US or Russia have managed to bring neutrality back to life as a fundamental principle of the international order, one pushed aside in the post-Cold War period, and especially during the War on Terror. From NATO members like Turkey to countries like India, which are friendly to the West, it is neutrality rather than pro-Russian sentiment that defines policy. For these states realize that Russia's war is a regional one meant to place limits on America's global politics. They also see that Russia is neither interested in nor capable of engaging in a global politics of its own that threatens them. It is only her immediate neighborhood that is at risk, and it certainly is at risk. Neutrality has thus allowed the Ukraine war to be geographically limited and regionalized against American intentions, while also allowing countries like Turkey to mediate between its protagonists. With the global politics made possible by a unipolar international order threatened in Ukraine, the US has reduced whatever autonomy the European Union possessed to create a Western bloc of countries, including Canada, the UK, and Australia, as well as Japan and South Korea, that is set against Russia. Now it faces the same quandary in the Middle East, where the Hamas attack on the 7th of October also demolished the region's post-Cold War politics, which had been defined by a globally agreed and guaranteed peace process leading to normalization, however slow. By contrast, the extra-legal activities of the Palestinian movement in the 1960s and 70s had been made possible by the Cold War, which allowed space for the PLO, like the IRA, the Red Brigades, and other militant groups to operate internationally. All of these were pushed into various kinds of negotiated settlements shepherded by the United States following the Soviet collapse. So we should recognize, for instance, that the Palestinian movement was very different in the 60s and 70s when it emerged, and it was part of a larger set of such movements which included the IRA, the Red Brigades, and other groups. And these were allowed their international play in the context of the Cold War, after which they were shepherded into various forms of negotiations by the US in particular. So from Camp David to Oslo and the so-called Abraham Accords, this was the kind of politics that characterized the unipolar moment. But it is one which the US can now defend only by opting for war to restore the status quo ante. This might then allow it to push for a two-state solution in which the Palestinians might be funded and managed by the international order. This too is part of the post-Cold War playbook of global politics, as exemplified by Bosnia and Kosovo, East Timor, and South Sudan, all wards of the international order rather than sovereign states. The dated nature of this vision is evident in the historical narratives that underpin it. If in Ukraine it was the Second World War and the Cold War that gave the conflict meaning, in the Middle East it is 9/11 that is routinely mentioned. We are told that the undeniably brutal attacks by Hamas were comparable only to 9/11 in their scale and in the percentage of people that were affected, indeed murdered, which was obviously greater in Israel than it was in the United States at 9/11. But this is a bad precedent given the consequences of the war on terror, while President Biden's invocation of an inflection point in history during his speech is not matched by any new vision for the future. He didn't mention one. What 9/11 did result in was the destruction of the international order put in place during the Cold War, one which had allowed for diplomatic, economic, and other relations between its rival camps. With the disappearance of the USSR and so any opposition to the remaining superpower globally, the US was able to marginalize the entire UN system by the expansion of preemptive strikes, unilateral and third-party sanctions, confiscations of sovereign funds, the legitimization of torture and extrajudicial killings, limitations of citizenship rights, and the dismantling through anti-terrorism laws of civil liberties like privacy, free speech, and the liberty to protest all over the world. Elaborated through interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also Pakistan, Syria, and Libya, such practices came to constitute a, quote, rules-based international order, close quote, which enjoys no formal agreement and therefore differs from the international law that had defined the UN order during the Cold War. We are seeing the consequences of the latter's final destruction in Eastern Europe and the Middle East today. So we've moved from international law to the so-called rules-based international order. The development of political practices outside international law was meant to be exceptional and reserved for the US and its Western allies. Such practices, in other words, were not meant to be normative ones and thus were unable to create a new international order, but they have come to be invoked by many countries as a new norm. Russia, for instance, has cited American practice in the war on terror to justify its actions in Ukraine, while Israel both invokes and goes beyond them in referring to the Allied bombing of civilians during the Second World War to justify its bombardment of Gaza. In both cases, political or rather military practice now takes its models from the period before or after the establishment of a post-war international order, that is to say, post-Second World War international order, and its rule of law. International law, in other words, seems to have become the exception rather than rule in defining the actions of states today. Are such practices coming to constitute a new, if yet informal, model of international relations, or do they signal the breakdown of such an order altogether? And I'm sure you can see how it is that the logic of exception that defines so much of the rules-based international order is incapable of becoming or giving rise to a new normative one. The exceptionality of arguing for the reduction of civil liberties, for instance, because of security threats, the increase of surveillance because of security threats, the acceptability of practices that would normally have been identified as torture because of security threats. The logic is entirely one of exceptionality, not of normativity. So there is an incapacity built into this order. Now, its liberation from international law does not make politics more realistic. It is not clear, for example, what can be achieved with Israel's onslaught on Gaza, which, apart from wreaking vengeance on Hamas, seems an impossible effort to regain the deterrence its leaders think keeps their country safe. In truth, only a political settlement can do that. But whether such deterrence succeeds is immaterial, for the US must retain its unipolarity to prevent the regionalization of politics that Hamas's attack signaled by discarding international mediation. The Abraham Accords had instead represented the region's division within a global context. They were meant to embed Israel as a leading power within a Sunni bloc set against Shia Iran and its allies. It was even suggested that if Saudi Arabia made peace with Israel, the Sunni world would fall into line. This unrealistic project, drawn from Orientalist stereotype, is now in tatters, given the Palestinian refusal to be shoehorned into it. Instead, we see a surge of regional support for the Palestinian cause that puts all the Arab regimes on edge. So the point is, both in Ukraine, where you have the United States globalizing a regional conflict, but unable to do so fully, and in the Middle East, where you see a regional conflict that is again sought to be globalized by the United States and her allies, what seems to be happening is the struggle between a global form of conceiving international order and a newly emergent regional form of doing so. And I want to talk about that distinction in what follows. America has therefore had to scupper Israel's autonomy just as it had the European Union's at the start of the Ukraine war in order to re-globalize the conflict and so maintain its unipolarity in the face of an emerging regional politics. Its Navy and Air Force have been deployed to the region precisely so as to prevent the war's regionalization. But rather than defining it in terms of Israel's national security, this array of forces has made the conflict a global one. Just as the Ukraine war has been regionalized by the neutrality of countries outside the West, however, so too might the war in the Middle East. Here, it is calls for a ceasefire that represents such neutrality. And though they have not for the moment proven successful, such calls do indicate that there is little sympathy globally for the politics of unipolarity. It is no accident that voting patterns on the UN resolutions dealing with Ukraine and Gaza are so similar, the West's policies having been repudiated by crushing majorities in both cases. These defeats will not stop the US and its allies from continuing with their policies, though the remarkable anti-Israeli shift in public opinion among their own citizens might give them pause for thought. Yet they had not been deterred by the even larger demonstrations of anti-war feeling in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. But what looked then like the hubris of untrammeled power now looks like desperation, as a failed project of global transformation is tried out again, this time to pull a region back under US management. The failure of the political imagination here is complete, with the reliance on force or the threat of its use indicating the collapse not only of the remnants of the Cold War's international order, but with it that of Western authority as much as hegemony in the Middle East and beyond. For no new political order guaranteeing peace and stability can be established by fear alone, however many local interests are served by it. But the failure of the political imagination is not confined to the US. The political categories deployed by those identified with the Israeli as much as Palestinian cause also belong to dead histories. On the Israeli side, for example, we have invocations of anti-Semitism, a term from 19th century Europe, as well as terrorism and genocide from the period following the Second World War. While the desire to eliminate Israel as a state is linked to the Holocaust as another kind of eliminationist fantasy. These may be accurate categories to describe some of the ideas and aims of Palestinian movements like Hamas, but they are also too broad and deployed too transhistorically to have much analytical purchase in understanding the specificity of events like those of October the 7th. And when used in essentialist ways, such terms give rise to conspiratorial narratives, very much like anti-Semitism itself, in which history is seen as being defined by unchanging motives and ends that foreclose any political settlement. The same is true of Palestinian invocations of settler colonialism, project dating to the Americas in early modern times, apartheid from post-war South Africa, and now genocide as well. Post-war South Africa, I mean post-Cold War South Africa. There is also a focus on punishing Israel by way of boycott, sanctions, and divestment, also linked to the dismantling of apartheid with the end of the Cold War. So the argument is made, just as moves for divesting from South Africa and sanctioning South Africa apparently worked in the getting rid of the ending of apartheid, so will such moves work in the liberation of Palestine. But sanctions emerged from colonial blockades to enter international law after the First World War as punitive measures short of armed conflict that target civilians. Their subsequent history has been more destructive than successful and cannot account for the end of apartheid, with the West only willing to abandon white South Africa once it was no longer needed as an ally after the Cold War. For its part, Israel's Jewish population includes immigrants, refugees, and exiles as much as settlers, and settler colonies give rise to nationalism, of which Zionism, like the Palestinian movement, are examples. These categories are open-ended and cannot tell us much about recent events if understood polemically rather than historically. So one doesn't have to repudiate the idea of Israel as a settler colony or even as an apartheid state, but one has to understand these categories in their historical complexity rather than as unchanging and unvarying ones. The narratives deployed by both sides also have far too much in common, with Palestinian nationalism often following the precedent of Zionism. The Holocaust as the trauma of Jewish nationhood is matched by the Nakba. The Jewish ghetto of Europe's past is paired with divided Palestinian villages in the West Bank. The Jewish right of return is countered by demands for the return of Palestinian refugees. The Temple Mount as a mobilizing religious symbol is an equivalent for Al-Aqsa. Each side lays claim to prior occupation of the land, with invocations of indigeneity making for dissonance in a global context where such ideas now characterize far-right and anti-immigrant parties. In many former settler colonies, of course, indigenous peoples constitute the remnants of pre-colonial populations to whom symbolic restitution is due, but which are too insignificant to possess political power. Though they are very differently situated, neither Palestinians nor Israelis fit into such models of indigeneity. We might more usefully consider what Ananya has spoken about, creolization, but no one ever does in this situation. If the terms and categories of political discourse on either side of the conflict are too generic to be analytically useful, they are also too intimate to make for a truly alternative political imagination, as I've suggested, by running one off against the other. This is because they are drawn from the universally accepted principles of the post-Second World War international order upon which each side claims to base its arguments. No one will disagree that anti-Semitism, terrorism, genocide, colonialism, or apartheid are bad things. They must therefore be disavowed and attributed to one's enemy in mutual accusations of hypocrisy. The Palestinian focus on boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, for example, emerged in the post-Cold War period of the peace process and thus is also formulated in the language of international law. Not only does it differ from the revolutionary internationalism of the PLO during the Cold War, it also makes its appeal largely in and to the West. Its success in building solidarity there also illustrates its limits in the world outside. It took the attacks by Hamas to demolish the post-Cold War Palestinian movement, dominated by international law and a moribund peace process. Whether Hamas will survive the transformation it made possible remains to be seen, though it seems Israel's defense doctrine will not. A hugely expensive policy built on military and technological superiority came undone in a few hours, its walls and bases unable to prevent the planning and execution of a major attack from a small territory subjected to intensive surveillance. Israel's dramatic response to this attack may even result from its loss of options in managing Gaza, which it can neither govern nor clear of population. Hamas had proven a reliable, if occasionally troublesome, interlocutor in the past, but now it supposedly cannot be allowed to run Gaza. This heralds the Strip's looming internationalization in a departure from Israeli policy, with the Palestinian Authority's delegitimization ensuring Hamas's return to it, even if under another name. The bombardment of Gaza seeks to buy time. In addition to recovering their deterrence, the Israelis may also want to degrade Hamas and render Gaza uninhabitable so as to delay the establishment of a Palestinian state there and in the West Bank, which is the official US policy. But their efforts to do so are daily squandering what goodwill Israel enjoys among its allies while whittling away at US hegemony everywhere. But enabling Israel also allows the US to draw a red line preventing the regionalization of politics and thus its own irrelevance to them. This requires maintaining undemocratic regimes with pliant leaders across the region, of which Israel itself is now one increasingly dominated by religious extremists. At the end of its unwinnable war in Gaza, the Americans might force the creation of a Palestinian state under international auspices in the hope it will become another Bosnia or Kosovo. But these Balkan territories are surrounded by hostile states, while the Palestinians will have regional support. No return to the past is possible, and Israel will either join the region or be an American protectorate within it. So taken together, Ukraine and Gaza allow us to see, I hope, the trajectory of post-Cold War history more clearly. It now appears that America's undisputed unipolar moment only lasted a decade, between 1989 and 2001, so between the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the War on Terror, when it was interrupted by the emergence of Al-Qaeda as a non-statist threat in a context where the US faced no serious rivals of a stately kind. Al-Qaeda's globalized militancy was meant to disrupt the social cohesion of countries rather than posing any kind of military challenge to them, which it could not. Its aim was to expose the hypocrisy and weakness of the West's liberal societies and destroy them from within. Responding to 9/11 as an opportunity to reinforce its unipolarity and remake the international order, the US ended up fulfilling, in many ways, Al-Qaeda's aims by demolishing the Cold War international order it had done so much to put in place. While the end of the War on Terror promised a return to some version of this UN system, events in Eastern Europe and the Middle East belie it by turning to unilateralism, brute force, and the crushing of dissent around the world. Already with the emergence of ISIS from American prisons in Iraq, it became clear that the War on Terror had led to a shift from global to regional forms of militancy by territorializing the conflict. Though it continued to draw from a global population of recruits, ISIS was unlike Al-Qaeda in its desire to capture and hold territory. It also turned its wrath from the West to internal enemies among Muslims themselves, most prominently the Shia and their would-be representative in the Islamic Republic of Iran. ISIS prefigured the regionalization of the post-9/11 international order, even as its diminution by the coordinated action of Kurdish, Iranian, and Iraqi militias with the US allowed the latter to imagine returning to a new global politics in which it prepared to contain the rise of China. Instead, it was faced with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, another effort to regionalize politics that the Americans unsuccessfully tried to turn into a global conflict. And now there is Gaza. While the Americans imagine a global politics in which their unipolarity must triumph over any attempt to create a bipolar or multipolar international order, historical developments appear to be moving in a rather different direction. Neither China nor Russia is in a position to take on the Cold War role of a superpower, and so threaten American unipolarity. Instead, it is a regional politics that has come to the fore internationally, one in which middle powers like Turkey and Iran in the Middle East, Brazil and South America, or South Africa on that continent are starting to play leading roles. The destruction of the UN system by the West has made such a regionalization a paying proposition, as has the failure of the rules-based international order to guarantee an equitable distribution of global goods, even in times of crisis, with the West's hoarding and monetization of vaccines during the pandemic serving as a good example of this. Deglobalization, if this is what it is not about states taking hold of the economy through their protectionist measures. This was an idea emblematized by terms like reshoring, which emerged during the pandemic in opposition to offshoring and the threats posed by its just-in-time supply chains in moments of global crisis. While legislative acts like President Biden's Green New Deal may succeed in making the US a hub for new technologies and innovation, they cannot push back the economic development of rivals like China or demolish the economy of enemies like Russia, even by the massive use of sanctions. the economy and its technologies remain global and have freed themselves from politics to the degree that we might be seeing the coming apart of political economy as a founding concept of modern capitalism. It is this separation of state from economy that makes deglobalization possible in the political arena, not least because global economic growth is no longer confined to or controlled by the West. Not all international politics, of course, can be regionalized. The West, for example, has been shaped by the US into the rump of a global formation through the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. Other parts of the world contain powers too big to be absorbed within regional politics, but not powerful enough to count as superpowers. This prevents the regionalization of politics there. China, for instance, is fully integrated into her neighborhood economically, including with Taiwan, her great enemy, but enjoys no political hegemony over it despite the military threat she poses certain countries there. Her only allies are North Korea and occasionally Pakistan. When I happened to be director of the Asian Studies Center at Oxford, and we had a few years ago Evan Medeiros, who was in charge of the China desk at the US State Department, coming to speak. And he said China has only two allies, North Korea and Pakistan. And with Pakistan, we don't always know because it can also be a US ally, which it is at the moment. India enjoys neither economic nor political hegemony in South Asia and must therefore assume a global role only in its alliance, possible or potential with the US. India is neutral on Ukraine but wavers on Israel because she can forsake neither the West nor the non-West. She makes common cause with the former not so much through democracy as in the past, the world's largest democracy, you will know that phrase, but rather through narratives around counterterrorism or anti-Islamist or anti-Muslim feeling, while identifying with Israel as a strong state in a hostile neighborhood. Torn between her global and regional ambitions, India's ambiguous international status reveals a great deal about the position of all the West's alleged rivals. Even when she had sought a leadership role in an Asian or Afro-Asian political project dating from colonial times, India had also wanted to be included within a Western geopolitical order. Well, you may recall that even at the height of the non-aligned movement, Nehru would frequently sacrifice going to non-aligned meetings and go to the Commonwealth conferences instead. He saw that as being more important. But this meant abandoning her own neighborhood to make common cause with the West. In earlier times, this was done in the language of a shared Aryan or Indo-European origin and culture that brought together not just India and the West, but India and Iran and Afghanistan in a relationship with the West that excluded the rest of Asia and the Arab world in particular. The regional dimension of this political imagination is still evident in the commonplace references to Iran as a civilizational peer of India's from pre-Islamic times. It's very interesting that to this day, the Ministry of External Affairs often refers to Iran as a civilizational peer of India's. A related, if also more recent way of globalizing India also requires abandoning her immediate neighborhood, this time identified as a security risk, to make common cause with the West in matters of anti-terrorism. It is as if India can only assume global status through the threats of global Islam or terrorism, not by adopting its universality so much as identifying with its supposed enemies. That is to say, global terrorism or militant Islam. That is, it can only become globalized in this vision of things through militant Islam or counterterrorism. After the war on terror, however, this is a policy with diminishing returns. China's ostensibly global identity, communism, it has a global identity, it's called communism, has been reduced to its domestic politics. It doesn't make use of communism as part of its global politics, which is actually quite fascinating when you think about it. While its regional identity of so-called Asian values is what China prefers and shares with its pro-Western neighbor Singapore. So in terms of civilizational identities, apparently anti-Western China and pro-Western Singapore share the same one. But it is a remarkably weak civilizational project defined largely against the West and so negative in character. The same is true of Russia, whose civilizational and so regional vision of itself is based on Orthodox Christianity and social conservatism. The latter again defined negatively against Euro-American liberalism. India therefore might identify herself as a civilizational state by way of Hindu nationalism, but is unable to fashion a regional identity of it. While Russia and China do possess such regional identities, though they are both old-fashioned in their derivation from 19th century models, as well as being negative and threadbare in substance. So these are big powers, but they are not necessarily regional ones. Might we therefore be entering a period in which two incompatible political models of the international order overlap? One is a global order made up of great power competition in which the US seeks to maintain its unipolarity against any future rivals. This is an old-fashioned vision modeled on the Cold War. It's completely a Cold War understanding of politics. The other is a regional one in which middle powers are active and great ones find themselves with a reduced political role insofar as they are too big to actively take on their rivals without putting the international order at risk. This may lead to a politics of détente between them eventually. How the US responds to these emerging arenas of international politics will define their future. At the moment, it maintains its unipolarity against non-existent threats while being unable to prevent the regionalization of politics internationally. And yet it may be regional rather than superpower politics that eventually reduces America's scope for action globally, even without affecting its military or economic predominance. We see this happening already, with non-Western allies and clients refusing to go along with the US on Ukraine and Gaza. Even Qatar, which depends completely on the US, it has the US Navy stationed there, has said no to the US in terms of cutting links or sanctioning Russia. And so has the UAE and Saudi Arabia. You can't imagine states more dependent on the US security umbrella, but they do not go along with it. But the loyalty of Western allies too cannot be taken for granted, as we are seeing in Eastern Europe with the winding down of the war in Ukraine. One need only think of France and Germany breaking ranks with the US during the invasion of Iraq for further examples. If such refusals have been made possible by the failure of the war on terror to put together a new international order, they were preceded by the equally remarkable refusals of former clients to accede to American demands. So there's a longer history of this refusal, which seems completely delusional in some respects. Manuel Noriega in Panama was perhaps the earliest example of this in the last century, followed by Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. They were all pragmatic leaders who survived by constant adaptation, and yet they all ended by opposing the US in violation of the former behavior. Had they no other choices, or did they deliberately choose self-destruction? More puzzling than the behavior of its clients in refusing to follow American directives has been that of the US itself in trying to resuscitate its post-Cold War unipolar moment. America was largely responsible for inventing the international order at the end of the First World War. Dominated by European empires and with the US itself not a member of the League of Nations, this order only lasted 20 years and was destroyed by its inner contradictions in the Second World War. The Americans then put together a more durable order with the United Nations. It lasted longer by bringing together the Cold War's rivals as well as former colonial and colonized countries in a joint enterprise where everyone felt they had something to gain. That order was destroyed by the end of the Cold War and especially in the War on Terror. But instead of putting together a third international order while she retains the power and credibility to do so, the US seems intent on destroying every vestige of one. What made the Cold War order a success, insofar as it retained legitimacy and lasted more than half a century, was that it was premised upon a balance of power. Unipolarity destroyed this order. Perhaps regionalization and its refusal of global politics will bring some balance back to international relations. Or we can imagine a new international order in which the US and its allies would come to some agreement with their enemies as they had with the USSR. Such an order would give emerging Asian, African, and South American powers decision-making roles in place of fading European ones. We can imagine a UN in which the Security Council is entrusted with interpreting rather than ignoring the General Assembly's decisions in the way a bicameral legislature works. It might also comprise a larger group representing the world's regions and so making for more legitimate decisions. Of course, this is a long-term desire of India's to be on the Security Council. But how to be on the Security Council is, of course, the question. Is it simply to join the existing order such as it is, or is it to transform it? And that, of course, is an open question. So this, of course, what I've just said about a new UN is, of course, a fantasy which takes the UN as its basis. But at the moment, all we are left with is fantasies which may become the basis of a new political imaginary. Such an imaginary will have to address the problem of how to bring together an old-fashioned great power politics that is global by definition with a new regional politics that seems to be emerging in various parts of the world. Interesting about the latter is that it appears capable of delinking from the former and ignoring it, as the US has been ignored by much of the world over Ukraine. This refusal to compete with the superpower and instead circumvent it represents an extraordinary political development which may not always be viable, but cannot be stopped either. It constitutes a balance of power quite different from any that we have ever seen before. since the task of those who speak in the name of neutrality is not to diminish or, for that matter, imitate American power, but rather evade it. A dinosaur from some lost age, the US remains immense and ferocious, but belongs to another world. Thank you.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Center. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.